everyone, welcome back to the Internet Report, where we uncover what's working and what's breaking on the internet, and why. This week we're discussing outages for Google Search, X and jsDelivr. I'm Barry Collins, and I'll be hosting today with the amazing Mike Hicks, Principal Solutions Analyst at Cisco ThousandEyes. As always, we've included chapters in the episode description below, so you can skip ahead to the sections that are most interesting to you. And if you haven't already, we'd love you to take a moment to like and subscribe. And for all our YouTube listeners, don't forget that we also release this show on all the major podcast platforms, so feel free to give us a follow over at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen. On with the show, and we're starting with that rare outage for Google Search on May the 2nd. I asked Mike to explain what he witnessed.
You say rare as well because we're so familiar and just going to Google Search, it's a verb. We're going to Google that. Can we Google that? So what we actually saw in this situation was when you actually went to the search page, you could get the search page, it would render, we'd get there. But then as soon as you tried to execute it, you got returned with an error. So it came up with a little robot figure and it came back with this 502 bad gateway error. And what that meant then was you actually couldn't execute a search. So you couldn't therefore go and search and see what was coming back.
There are some clues in the data that suggest this wasn't a load-related issue, but something in the back end. Explain why that's your theory, Mike.
There's a couple of things here. So if we think about how we make a connection when we go into the search page, we put in google.com and we then start to do the search query on that. So we get that front page loaded at that point there. That's actually sort of connecting in at different levels. So when we type in the name, we're doing things like we're doing resolving the name with the DNS. And if we actually think there's this thing called the OSI 7-layer model, which describes these functions coming down. So you have at the top the application, the presentation, the session layer into the network and so on until you come down to physical connectivity. Each one of these layers has to communicate with each other. And identifying where you have these breaks gives us indication of essentially where the issue is and where we can see what's going on. So what we're seeing here is we started to see at that layer 4, the HTTP, we're making connections to that front-end server. We start to see a small degradation coming down. So we see it in steps. So we see there we can actually sort of make connectivity coming in. And we know that because we've got the page. The other thing we then started to see is if we look at that at a transactional level. So we actually then go to look at when we're doing that search. So I'm executing the search. I've gone to my next stage. I've typed in a query and I've gone away to search to understand how many games Arsenal will actually win this year.
Mike's an Arsenal football fan, if you're wondering why he's putting that into the search engine. So, as Mike's explained, by this point we've moved up the stack and started to make search queries. What happens when users try to get those search results?
If we think about all the searches that occur on Google and it's actually used for a whole bunch of other things, when we actually looked at that transactional level, we saw it in a lights out, lights off type of situation. What I mean by that is there's an abrupt drop at that transaction level. So we see it coming in and it drops straight off, sort of, a cliff face coming down. And then again, the same when it's recovered. So it was, as I said, when we talk about lights on, lights off, there's this sudden outage occurring at that transaction level. At that connectivity level, at that front end, it was sort of a little more gradual. We saw sort of steps. During the outage, we saw some sort of indications of it trying to make those connectivities. The other thing I said is there's thousands, millions of searches going on at any one time from there. Now, what would trigger an increase in load would have been some sort of outside influence. So something happening in the world that would actually sort of trigger everybody to want to go and search. And, we hear talk about things trending, and these are the types of things that sort of do that. There was nothing occurring at that time. So it's a bit of a leap, but we're making this assumption that it wasn't load related because there was no sudden increase. And then coupled that with this lights on, lights off, we can say, okay, it was some sort of back-end system issue where we're starting to get that connectivity.
And just to be clear, there was no other Google services affected that you saw at the time. It was just a search.
It's actually a really good point. And we often talk about this distributed architecture. We talk about these single points of aggregation or single points of failure. And what we'll see is these services being used by multiple parts of the same application as well, or same part of service. And the search engine is one of these. So the search engine or the back-end systems that power the search engine is used in things like sort of the Gmail stuff to actually do the searches. It could be used in sort of Google Maps where we're actually doing the search for location. We're doing all these sort of queries in the back end. And when we were looking through the ThousandEyes data, I couldn't see any references or any outages that was impacting those as well, which again, is really good case because it points to us saying, right, it was this connectivity between that front end search engine, that web front end, and how I then interact with the back, as opposed to a failure within that search engine itself. Which we have seen in the past. We've seen some issues previously where there's a problem with indexing and that search failed. And then that propagated across all the services that leverage that. And in this case, we didn't see that. As I said, we just saw it very much contained within that google.com domain.
Our next outage is at X, formerly known as Twitter, which suffered an hour-long outage on April the 29th. Explain what the ThousandEyes data told you about this one, Mike.
The data differed in this case, and it was actually really intuitive. I'm actually looking at these patterns, and I'm a big fan of patterns and seeing what happened here. Now, as we talked about with the Google outages, the fact we were actually getting a status code coming back, an error code coming back, is indicative of I'm making that connectivity and there's something I can't reach it. So it's giving me a bad gateway or service unavailable, a sort of an error that's a server-side error to indicate something coming back there. Now, we didn't see that in this case. What we actually saw was actually timing out. And the other thing we actually saw in the data there was the way the patterns actually built up. So if I was looking at this from a holistic perspective, so I'm looking across all the tests that ThousandEyes have running into X there. First of all, I could see this as a global outage. So I could see it sort of impacting everybody, every region around the world there. But the other thing is I started to see this step increase. Now, when we see a step increase, and we're looking at this a step as in terms of impacted servers. And that is servers that are sort of playing this timeout error message that we're seeing, or we're connecting to the server or attempting to make a request to the server, and we're seeing it time out. So that number of servers steadily increased. So remember when we talked about the Google, we talked about that transaction level, the lights on, lights off. In this case, it was a graduated step coming up. Now, what that tells me, if I'm looking at that, is that then is a load type of issue related, because all of a sudden I'm starting to have this build up of systems impacted, and therefore then load could be a contributor to it. When we talk about load, we're not necessarily talking about the load coming from the outside, but I'm talking about the way the requests are being distributed in that back-end system. In this case, load reflected itself as the number of servers that are impacted, and that steadily increased as we saw the outage continue.
It seemed to take a while for X to recover from this one and for the page load times to return to normal. What might cause that?
Again, if we're looking at this from a load perspective, what the things that can sort of occur is that if we have a load, we have to sort of clear that backlog. We have to clear that buffer. Once X have identified where that issue lies and they've instigated either a rollback or some sort of mitigation or workaround service to restore the thing, we then effectively have to clear the backlog. So the way we're making these requests, even if it's coming in from a load balance situation or it's actually going into the various servers there, we obviously have this whole series of queues. So you have to clear those. Now, when we actually did see the recovery, we actually saw it from, again, this holistic perspective. It came down quite quick. It wasn't as long as the other one, but once we've identified the issue, then we need to come back. And it could be that you need to switch resources to a different load balancer to switch things around. We don't really know what happened in the back end, but something occurred there and then you started to clear it. But then how that manifested itself in the end user data was as soon as the issue was cleared, again, everything would work. We could start to get on there. But what we saw was these spikes in page load time. So as the service was recovering, we had the ability now to connect into the back end. So therefore, we could make a request. We could send our message. We could scroll down and get new content. That was all being served. So everything was right there. But the time to actually load that page when we're looking at it from the ThousandEyes data had sort of increased. And that to me, again, shows that I'm actually clearing some sort of backlog. So I've actually got connectivity. I'm starting to clear some backlog there.
From a service provider's point of view, would it be tempting sometimes to almost flick the power switch and reset the queues rather than wait for a gradual resumption of traffic?
It is, and it does happen quite a lot. We'll see that, the way it'll be worded within there, and again, we don't know specifically if this happened in this case, but we've certainly seen it in the past, where they'll word it like they reset a system. And it's not that's tempting to do. That is the best option. What they've gone through and they've triaged the issue and we said, oh, here it is here. Something's gone offline. And the easiest way to restore that is just to turn it off and on again. And that does happen quite a lot. We've actually started to see this, and this becomes sort of quite prevalent, really, if you're thinking about these situations where we've seen in some of the co-locations, the hosted environments, where they have these power issues. When you start to get lower power is when you start to get this corruption of data. And the easiest way to fix that, because there's nothing I can do, I haven't made a configuration change, I can't roll something back, I can't bring another instance online. So the only option in that case is to sort of power cycle it. But this again sort of comes back to this point of, if I can understand my entire service delivery chain and I can understand specifically where that fault domain is, and now I can attribute responsibility of who it is to resolve that, that means then I can take the best decision. I know this is where it is. We know it's caused because of a power issue or whatever happens to be there. The best thing for us to do based on our processes, our playbook, is to actually power it off, power it back on again, and then things can restore. I will add to that, it does depend on where within that service delivery chain it is. There's some systems like I don't want to power a server on and off, but I can power a load balancer on and off because I'm going to reset the queues. There's different things and different features, which again, if I identify the components within there, I can take the most appropriate action for each.
jsDelivr provides CDN services for many websites, but it was recently hit by an unusual outage that had consequences for the website owners. Over to Mike to explain what happened here.
So jsDelivr are an open source CDN provider. And what we observed was in Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe, they're actually affected by this 5-hour outage. Now, what happened in this situation was it turned out to be, it was actually a certificate that was out of date that then caused the failure to connect. Now, the problem with this is that if I had a website that was using jsDelivr as my CDN, then what was occurring, then you go to it and you say, this is untrusted location, I couldn't get there because you couldn't verify the certification. Now, what it turned out to be was they actually hosted within Cloudflare, and they have quite a sophisticated or unique way of actually allocating, reissuing the certificates. And when this certificate expired, they actually changed the method they tried to reissue the certificate under. So Cloudflare, that is. Now, Cloudflare issued a certificate using HTTP, and it didn't actually recognize it coming into the jsDelivr system. So what it did at that case, if I don't recognize it, I default back. Instead of issuing a new one, it defaulted back to a certificate from 2020. So obviously that meant it was out of date.
That out-of-date certificate meant that anyone visiting the site using jsDelivr was turned away by their web browser because it was now an untrusted location.
There's a couple of things with this. One of those is that although this is connected to the system, it was a certificate that was being issued essentially by Cloudflare to the systems that are running the jsDelivr stuff. So this was sort of far removed. So if I'm actually using the jsDelivr as my CDN, my open source CDN there, I wouldn't have actually known what was going on at that point. All I've seen was this. So I'd have spent time troubleshooting my website. And in fact, I had some customers contact me and say, what's going on? We have this problem. We can't get to a website. We're there. And they were talking about trying to reload their code. And sort of till we brought it back and then we could actually see what was going on and sort of tell them what was happening there. Connected to that really is this concept of the fact that this one piece was then sort of breaking. Now, certificates, they do expire, and obviously people have systems to go in place, but they'll have actually believed that everything was in place and had been reissued. It wasn't the fact that it expired, it was the fact that the reissuing of that certificate or the refreshing of that certificate had failed. That was something within the process that failed, and it was sort of invisible to that service delivery chain, but it was dependent on it making that connectivity.
What learnings can NetOps teams take from an incident such as this, Mike?
There's a couple of things here, really. And if we actually sort of take that outside of the actual outage itself, so we said, this is a fairly unique way that the DigiCerts were actually reauthorized or reissued there. But let's take it back to the other way. So let's actually say we have a certificate expiring. And this is, can be quite a common occurrence. One thing I've actually got to do is I need to be able to understand when that's going to expire and sort of take actions for it. So the first thing again, and I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but if I can identify every part of my service delivery chain, if I take responsibility for everything that goes across there. Now, we're used to talking about service delivery chain in something of a linear fashion. Right, but in reality, if you talk about it, it is this sort of mesh, this network, as it were, of connectivity, interconnectivity, and dependencies around there. So it's not such a question of sort of mapping those out, but it's understanding how they'll interact together and therefore identifying which common part of that could actually cause me a problem. And if we go back even when we talk about that OSI 7-layer model, if I understand that interaction that goes across there, again, that helps me identify my fault domains. I know the very first thing that's going to happen is I need to validate to that certificate. So if that's not validated, yes, I can resolve the name. Yes, I can make that connectivity, but I'm not going to go any further onto that site. So identifying where that is, that takes place as I make my connection, but it essentially for most part is actually invisible. So I have to understand that dependency exists, and therefore then I have to be able to make sure I can track that. And there's sort of various things. We have some customers who are sort of doing this where they're using ThousandEyes to make sure they can actually sort of see when a certificate is about to expire. And then even through some integration like with sort of Red Hat, event-driven Ansible, you can then sort of get the certificate to reissue. But again, it's understanding each one of those components and what action do I need to take and when do I need to take it. And you can do that by identifying the signals that occur within my entire service delivery chain.
Finally, for this episode, we're looking at the overall global outage numbers for the past fortnight. What's the data showing, Mike?
If we go back to the previous one, as April started, we saw the numbers increase. Well, now this previous period, we've actually sort of seen them decrease. So from April 22nd to 28th, the outage actually reduced by 8%, and then by 3% from April 29th to May the 5th. This was actually reflected again in the US, where I saw a 36% decrease from that first week there, from April 22nd to 28th, and then it was followed by a 7% decrease in the following week. So the other thing then is if I actually take those numbers and I say, so how many of those US-centric outages were reflected in the global outages that we observed there? Now, in this occasion, on this period, we actually saw 34% of the network outages occurred in the US. So from the April 22nd to May 5th period. Now, if you remember, we've talked about this over the previous episodes. We've been seeing for a long time where these outages have all been over 40%. So US-centric outages have been over 40%. We can actually equate that if we look at it. Again, we saw the numbers down. So again, I saw the numbers drop in the US figures there. So the numbers sort of slightly increase in Europe, which is then why I saw this drop occur for the US numbers. It'll be interesting to see sort of how that goes. So if we actually take the previous ones, we've been consistently sitting over 40% for a long period of time now, with just occasional drops down. But as I said, we'll see if this trend continues into future weeks.
So we've hit a month end with final figures for April. How do they compare to March?
So in April, there were 687 global outages, which is a 1% increase from March, where we saw 678 outages. And again, the number in the US outages increased again. So we saw that increase by 3%, where it went up from 289 to 299. So sort of small increases, but increases nonetheless.
And year on year, what's the data looking like compared to 2023?
The patterns actually match. You know, we talked about this where I sort of see these patterns, seasonal patterns as they were, sort of come up and down. And again, as I come out of March and go into April, I constantly seen over the previous couple of years where we've actually had this rise into April. Now, the percentage figures sort of differ, but there's definitely been a rise coming in from there. And there's different conditions which would occur to that. So if I go back a couple of years, there might have been a significant outage that sort of affected those figures. But if I actually take those out and look basic at those maintenance figures, then they all sort of come in the same.
And that's our show. Please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And not only does this ensure you're in the know when a new episode's published, it also helps us to shape the show for you. You can follow us on X at @ThousandEyes or send questions and feedback to internetreport@ThousandEyes.com. Until next time, from Mike and me, goodbye.